This presentation is on serialism. The definition of serialism, according to the Oxford Companion to Music, is simply a note-row technique. This can be further explained as a structural principle of a series of notes, normally in a row, and these rows can affect pitch, rhythm, duration and dynamics. The term serial applies to all 12-tone music. On screen now is a 12-tone row matrix made up of these rows. So why did serialism come about? Well, firstly, if you look all the way back to the dawn of functional harmony, it permits the use of chromaticism in the context of ornamentation and passing notes. But throughout the Romantic period, many composers broke away from this, using unrelated key changes or particularly chromatic passages. In the early 20th century, Debussy and Strauss wrote free atonal music, which stretched the upper bounds of this functional harmony. It wasn't particularly popular with the public eye, as they felt it was too different from everything previous, and a man named Schoenberg particularly disapproved as well, but for different reasons. He felt that Debussy and Strauss still fell into tonal tropes and stressed one note or chord more than another. So in the 1920s, Schoenberg developed a 12-tone system which meant it was mathematically impossible to fall into tonal tropes. It still doesn't really explain the cause of serialism, though. At the turn of the century, many new things were seen by the public. Manned flights, automobiles on public roads, and Freud's new psychology theories changed the way that people looked at each other. And in visual art, the introduction of cubism and the avant-garde, possibly the closest of these things to serialist music. You can see here the angular edges and the colours that don't really fit together quite well represent the serialist movement. If all of these things could change, it made sense that music could as well. Back to Schoenberg, who can definitely be considered the father of serialism in the 1920s. Schoenberg was also a visual artist. He was a painter in his own right. These are some of his most notable works, particularly this one called The Red Gaze. Without a doubt, it can be said that he was inspired by similar styles, both in his visual art and music. His music was so unpopular at this time that he was forced to leave the Second Viennese School, where he taught and lived at for the majority of the first half of the 20th century. Schoenberg persisted with writing this style of music, despite it having mixed reactions. There are theories that his drive for it was also political. Schoenberg was Jewish and lived in Austria in the early half of the century. During the Nazis' rise to power in the 1930s, they used Wagner and other classical European composers to promote their ideologies. It's thought that Schoenberg's serialist writing was an attempt to be as far away from this as possible. There is evidence to support this by the location of many serialist composers. They are in the most part European, much like fascism was in the early half of the 20th century. The Nazi Party described serialist art as degenerative art, banning publication and performances of the works. The new ease of listening to music given by technology at the time was invaluable to composers, musicians, and people who wished to share serialist compositions under Nazi rule. Recorded music was crucial during this time, as it was hard to hide in a legal performance. It's understandable that due to the underground nature of serialism in these early formative years, that it never really surfaced. It was also a boost for the genre, however. Much like swing music, being banned by the Nazi Party meant that it was the music of the rebels. I've said frequently how unpopular serialist and atonal music was, so who really listened to it? What culture surrounded it, and what culture did it leave behind? John Cage was a serialist composer who did much of his work in the latter half of the 20th century. This makes him a much more contemporary example, making it a lot easier to relate to musically and creatively, unlike century-old composers perhaps like Debussy and Schoenberg. One of John Cage's most famous pieces was called 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence. This put him in the public eye, and in doing so, increased the awareness of serialism as a genre, despite 4 minute 33 not actually being a serialist piece. Many popular musicians say they were influenced by John Cage, including Yoko Ono, the Beatles, and the Velvet Underground. Perhaps serialism isn't currently seen in the strictest fashion that Schoenberg originally intended, but it has clearly had an impact on some of the most famous contemporary musicians. It can definitely be seen as a cultural and political rebellion, almost likened possibly to punk. But unlike punk, it wasn't a destructive rebellion, it was an intellectual one. By the 1950s, there was a large mutual respect between serialist musicians. It was a sign of intelligence, and that you are better than functional harmony musicians. The public possibly never saw this, but it was a definite way of showing hierarchy in the musical circles. There's a quote here from Paul Thomas about serialist composers in the 1970s, possibly the decade where serialist music was at its most popular. It states, "The serialists commanded intellectual prestige and held influential academic posts. All they lacked was a public." It seemed at first that the reason serialist music didn't catch on with the public was because it was too much of a leap from previous works. It makes sense that with time, a certain genre of music can gather a publicity. But it's nearly been a century now. As Philip Ball said, none of the 50 top-selling composers through the UK's music retailer HMV through 2003 to 2008 composed in an atonal style. It seems that unlike most other genres of music, where the culture is mostly built by the fans, the only culture surrounding serialism is that of the composers. So as a political style of music, how revolutionary is it really from the typical music we're used to? Many purists like Stockhausen saw the 12-tone technique as a kind of thematicism, a technique used for hundreds of years now. From here he led to pointillist music. Two of Schoenberg's biggest techniques, retrograde and inversion, can easily be seen in traditional counterpoint. And in 1944, Hallerwurz found examples of row techniques in Mozart and Beethoven's works. So it's possible that this revolutionary rebellion never really caught on, because at its foundations it wasn't particularly revolutionary.